Before we get to all that, let's back up a little. Let's just lay out some basic definitions, because I do find that with a lot of this, people don't even understand what a feminist is anymore. You know, you have your first wave feminists, your second wave feminists, third wave feminists. Now there's things beyond that you've coined. So can you just break down some of the basic, what was the first feminist movement? Just give me a couple breakdowns.
Well, that would be the suffrage movement, and that was the struggle for the vote. And then after women earned the vote, there was a period of quiescence, and we didn't hear much from feminists throughout the 30s, the 40s, the 50s. Then it came back in the late 60s, early 70s, and that was the second wave. And it had work to do. There were a lot of just arbitrary barriers preventing women, holding women back. They needed to be taken down. It was obviously time to do that. And
so this was stuff more like in the workforce, things like that.
Changing the workplace, changing education, addressing things of, legally for women to have more defenses against harassment in the workplace and so forth. All of that, I was totally on board. That's just basic quest for equality. But what happened is that the second wave of feminism, a lot of the women in the universities were quite radical, and they were not about equality. They were not about, I see feminism, the best of feminism, it came from the European Enlightenment, and it was about the intrinsic dignity of all men and women and extending equality of opportunity and liberty and so forth to all. Many of them reject the Enlightenment, and they're not about freedom and freedom of expression, and they are they use their classrooms, I think, to promote a very rigid worldview about how women are preyed upon by men, and it's almost as if better things got for women, the more bitter they became. And I watched this from close up because I was teaching in the university. I watched it, and I kept thinking they would be discredited because their views will not withstand 20 minutes in a seminar room with some just objective scholars.
Right.
But they do not subject their research to scrutiny of objective scholars. They evaluate one another.
Right, so was this a strange example of where things could exist sort of in the academic world where perhaps these ideas wouldn't have played out in the real world?
Well, they didn't, and I didn't see them in the real world. And I thought they would be contained in the academy and then would go away. That has not happened, partly because of social media and these Twitter mobs and things. It's come into the mainstream, and now we hear these words like trigger warning.
Oh, we're going to get to plenty of that. We should have issued a trigger warning before we sat down.
Oh, we should have.
Yeah.
Yes,
Is this a
I
safe
am
space?
a walking trigger warning.
Yeah. Oh, do you consider this a safe space?
I'm feeling fairly
Freaked?
a little microaggressed upon, but not too much.
Okay, so then that was second wave feminism, right?
So the second wave was
evolved into that, yeah.
But the second wave had a radical extreme, and that extreme became the mean because they got a monopoly on the professorships.
And that's what you would refer to then as third wave feminism.
Well, third wave is probably the intersectional feminism, or there are various names for it. But it didn't correct the excesses of second wave feminism. It took those excesses and made them even more extreme.
Yeah. Now, what would you say to the people that would say, well, all along that ride, even if they were to acknowledge some of the things that you're saying, all along that ride, things basically were getting better for women, so maybe there was some reasoning behind it,
There was some reasoning, but at a certain point, what you had is just people, it was kind of a power grab. And there were women like me, Camille Paglia, a lot of libertarian feminists, dissident feminists. We were just disinvited to the party. And students didn't have the benefit of hearing a range of opinion on contentious issues. Take something like the wage gap.
Yeah.
If you are an economist and you hear that Group A is earning less than Group B, you want to know why. They immediately say discrimination. They blame employers and the patriarchy. But if you do the proper controls that any competent economist would do, and you ask, well, do they differ in any way? Do all the men, because when you hear that wage gap, they're just doing the average of all the men in the workplace working full-time and all the women. Well, men and women do not study the same top subjects in college. They do not work the same number of hours. Men on average work more hours. They take more dangerous jobs. Women are far more likely to take a few years out of the workplace or more. These are relevant to your earnings. So then what happens when we do the proper controls? And there are some very good studies. The Labor Department commissioned a fantastic study that did all the proper controls. It gets to a point where there are just a few cents you can't explain. Now, it could be discrimination, and I'm enough of an equity feminist to worry about that if I'm being cheated out of a few pennies, or women are. But chances are it's not. Chances are it would turn out there's some innocent explanation.
Yeah, so when it comes to the wage gaps and things like that, so I watched a whole bunch of videos on it before. I watched the video you did on it before this, and partly what I think is what I think when I watch most political things or almost anything related to news these days, I never know who to trust.
Right.
That I watch these studies and I say, this study, well, why was it done this way? Who funded this? Who funded that? How do you, in the mix of all this, figure out what to actually believe?
What I do, excuse me, as the factual feminist, I try to determine, well, who's the best source? Who sets the gold standard for this research? So when it comes to education, nothing surpasses the Department of Education. Mm-hmm. They collect statistics, and they are very good. When it comes to crime, do I believe a feminist activist that tells me that we're all, the majority of women or a quarter of women are being raped and assaulted and battered or more? I go to the Bureau of Justice Statistics and look at what do the statisticians who do careful and highly disciplined statistical analyses, what do they find? And they find something very different. Yeah. And they find rape is a terrible, horrendous crime, but it is fairly rare on the campus. It is not 1 in 4 or 1 in 5. And so I present that. I show people these are what sort of objective researchers have found. These are what the advocates have found. Now, some people just want to believe the advocates. I don't understand that.
Yeah, all right. Well, I do want to touch on that in a little bit, but just to finish up just sort of the waves of feminism. Now, you consider yourself, and you coined the phrase, I think, equity feminist, right? Mm-hmm. Can you tell people what
So an equity feminist, I hope you are, we all are, is someone who wants for women what he or she wants for everyone. Fair treatment, no discrimination. It's basically comes, as I said, from the Enlightenment. It's classical feminism. It's about fairness. It doesn't even have to be called feminism. It's probably humanism or peopleism or equalism. Mm-hmm. And that's what I assumed most people would be for. Today, feminism tends to denote people who are carried away with male bashing. If I had to reduce it to a few sentences, it would be women are from Venus and men are from hell. They seem carried away with female chauvinism. I hate to say it.
Okay, so from there now, let's backtrack to what you just said about the campus stuff, because I know this is a place where you get a lot of heat for this when you've talked about the rape situation.
Yes, I went to Oberlin College, and everyone was triggered, and 30 people and a dog fled to a safe space. They had a safe room. There was a therapy dog, apparently, and 30 triggered young women, and they went to a safe room. And they were so.
Wait, can we really try to parse that out? What does that actually mean? Because I know we know what it means, and we joke about this stuff all the time.
I wish
online.
I didn't know.
But they literally, because you were coming to speak,
they felt that I would give them PTSD. Now, I have been lecturing on campuses for years, and it used to be they'd come and argue, and sometimes we'd part as friends or go to a bar and kind of have a good time, like human beings. Yeah. And if someone presents me with some good data and good arguments, I'll change my mind. I've changed my mind many times, and I look forward to doing it again. Yeah. But they were not. Something has changed in the last few years on the campus, and there's been this medicalization of the curriculum, and they need trigger warnings for their classes and trigger warnings for this and that. And as I said, they needed them for me, and they needed a safe space where they could retreat, because as one of them put it, someone would be invalidating my experience. It's like the worst thing that can happen to you.
Right, so
that sounds like a good thing to happen. And then, because you can't just go by your experience, you have to test it and see if your interpretation holds up to criticism. They were not interested in any kind of criticism.
Right, so when you hear this happen and you see this happen to you, and you say, okay, here's the empirical evidence about what's happening with rape on campus, and then they say, what is their counter argument? Is the counter argument that there's more rape that goes underreported for X, Y, or Z, or they're not counting, girls that got drugged or something. I mean, what's the? I get that we've become this society that's afraid of every bit of information, but what's the counter argument?
Yeah, well, they cite their own studies. But I've spent many years, and so many other people, looking at these methodological failures. And that there are ways in which we could throw together a survey tonight and ask people questions and find an epidemic of whatever you want. All you have to do is ask questions that are a little vague, and it helps too to ask a non-representative sample of people. And that's what they do. They ask vague, usually a mix of serious questions, but then a few vague ones. That's all you need. Now, does it mean your study is going to be valid? No. Does it mean you're going to generate some useful propaganda for your cause? Yes.
Yeah. All right. So I saw that piece at Oberlin, and then the other thing that I saw you got heat for was the catcalling. Right? There was this video about catcalling, and you've sort of said or written about that this is not really a thing. Not really a thing that, well, it exists, but not a thing to be upset by, sort of.
Well, it's complicated. And as I said, there are times where it's very threatening, but you have to make distinctions. And this is the basis of thought. I mean, human rationality, making distinctions. And being out in the public square, there are going to be interactions. You know, people will come up with petitions, people will beg for money, people will say things. It's just part of being alive.
Yeah.
And these control freaks think that we can police everything that's said on the street, and they were actually suggesting that it be against the law to catcall a woman. Well, again, I make a distinction between someone saying, "Hi, beautiful." I mean, frankly, that wouldn't bother me. It might have bothered me when I was younger, but as you get older, you don't mind it.
Right.
But when which somebody's saying something disgusting or frightening, or stalking you, that's very different. But to them, it's all the same. It's all a micro or a macro aggression, and they want a law against it. And what I pointed out in my video is that in Washington, D.C., there's a place where you can walk and you will be catcalled. And I have walked there many times, and it's in a very busy part near DuPont Circle, and it's a lot of women dressed for success, you know, in their Manolo Blahniks, they're walking through, and the men catcall. Well, the men are homeless, you know, people living in this park, and they make comments. So there is a huge class difference between these women. Are we supposed to think these women need to be protected from these guys who are the have-nots?
Right, so that's an interesting discrepancy, that it's not Wall Street bankers walking down the street making these comments, where then there's sort of an added layer of financial difference and social status and all that.
Right.
It's usually coming from people beneath, I suppose.
Not always,
not
but
always.
Often.
Yeah.
At least
but does
in my
is that
neighborhood.
enough to dismiss it? You know, I get what you're saying. There's a wild discrepancy between, you know, you're cute or whistling at a girl, or versus leering and following.
Look, I think men should know that it bothers women. I'm not sure it bothers all women. I mean, I think it depends on the woman, and you know, it's very complicated.
Yeah.
I don't want the women who are the most hypersensitive and sort of freaked out about male attention. I don't think they should be able to write the rules. I think they should consult other women. What I suspect you would find is that it can be annoying. I mean, as I said, I remember being younger and being annoyed, but it was mainly, well, there were, I mean, it didn't happen that much on Wall Street or in Manhattan, but so there did seem to be an element of class involved. But I think you have to, you know, I think in different cultures, the women react to it differently. There are different mores and things. But in my neighborhood in Washington, D.C., I don't see it happening in where I live.
So basically what I sense is you're pretty much saying that your fear in this would be that if you were to allow some laws to be passed related to all this stuff, that you're handing the power over sort of the authoritarian.
Oh, you hand it to the police, they can arrest anybody.
Yeah.
And it would be these, I mean, I think in D.C. it would be these poor guys. And so I think, you know, most men want to be decent human beings, and they should know women don't appreciate it, and that most don't, and especially if it's in, you know, kind of pushy and certainly if it's offensive. But then don't make laws and don't invite the police in. This is there's so much of this inviting authorities in, and some have called it the pink police state, you know, this feminist police state that we have on campus where kids in public universities, the young men are afraid to tell a joke or to say anything that could
I know comedians at comedy clubs that are afraid to say
well, they're unwelcome on campus. It's a hostile environment for humor.
Yeah.
And so that's why you have to be careful. And sometimes you'll get what you wish for, but then you get a lot more. You get a lot more repression, authoritarianism. It's just not worth it.
Yeah, so is some of that also that the feminism movement has been a victim of its own success in a weird way? Because it seems to me that feminists now should be fighting so much more for women's rights in other countries. Now, of course, we have a long way to go here, but when we see all kinds of horrible things happen, you know, women still can't drive in Saudi Arabia, one of our biggest allies in the Gulf, you know.
Right.
This is not an enemy country. And all over the Middle East and all over Africa, where women's rights are basically trampled on, if not non-existent. Why don't feminist groups focus on that at all?
You do have genuine patriarchal oppressive societies, and what's happening to women's rights in Iran is terrifying. Of course, in Saudi Arabia, many parts of the world. I've been to international women's conferences, and you meet these women who represent women from their countries. I've met them from Cambodia and Yemen and Egypt and so forth, and it's very inspiring. It's like meeting the Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, the feminist foremothers of their society.
Yeah.
And you would think that on the campus, these young women would be, especially young women that are idealistic and want to be activists, you'd think they'd be making common cause with those women.
Yeah.
Instead, these women at Oberlin and Georgetown and Yale, they're protesting the men on their campus because they feel they feel that they are like these women that are oppressed in Iran, that they have it as bad or worse. So it's delusional.
Yeah, so I think there's something much bigger going on here, and I think this is why so much of our audience, especially on Twitter, likes what we're both doing and what people like Joe Rogan and Gad Saad and Milo and many others are talking about. There's some weird movement of authoritarians where the left now, which is supposed to be about free thinking and debating ideas and doing this, right, where the left is now throwing out half the people. I had Sarah Hayter on last week, and this is an ex-Muslim who stands up for every liberal ideal. The left should love her, and they shun her. At best, they actually treat her worse than being shunned.
When I wrote my first book, which was protesting the authoritarianism of feminism and the anti-intellectualism, the conspiracy theories, all of that, I expected to have a good reception from feminist scholars, because I just assumed there was a silent majority of reasonable women. And I did. I heard from some great women, from Nadine Strawson, then president of the ACLU. I heard from Erica Jong, you know, this pro-sex feminist novelist and so forth. And they were great. But my colleagues in the academy were furious that I had criticized, and they thought that criticism was the same as a kind of betrayal and showed that you were on the side of, the forces of evil. So they didn't just disagree with you, they thought you were evil. Yeah. Now they don't just disagree with you, they think you're evil and that you give them PTSD.
Yeah, so you give them PTSD, and then doesn't it give them a license to say and virtually do anything they want to you? Because I could give you a zillion examples of times where I've seen anyone that shifts a little bit away from people on the left, where they are slandered and smeared and written horrible things about. Well, it's
fascinating, isn't it? Because they do to other people exactly what they say
the right is doing.
The right. They demonize, they objectify, they otherize, to use their word. They macro. They're massive macro and micro and nano aggressions. They don't hesitate to be rude, snarky, and there's so much meanness. I don't understand feminism with meanness. It was when I know there was some eccentric, angry women from the beginning of the second wave, but mostly the lived experience of most women who were enjoying their liberation was happiness and joy and being friends with men, not going to war with them.
Yeah, so where does this strange collusion of all these people that all end up on the left doing this? I've said repeatedly on this show, the reason I talk about this all the time and the reason I tweet about the regressive left and want to talk about this is because I don't want the left to go over the deep end. And that's why I'm talking about talking with a cross-section of people from literally all over the world, because I'm afraid what happened to the right, where it went so far right, is happening
to the left
right now. What brings these people together, do you think, when often they shouldn't have a lot in common?
Well, I will tell you what I know best is among the feminists is a small group in the universities gain control of the knowledge base. I mean, what we think we know about men and women. So you're a journalist and you need to know something about the wage gap, or you need to know something about women and in education, you go to these people, and they are, what the journalist doesn't know, or the politician or the interested party doesn't know, is that they're spinning, and they have an ideology that drives their research. So I think a lot of people don't realize that there's so much spurious scholarship. So they take it seriously. And now there are untruths, exaggerations, factoids that have been repeated so often they're almost beyond the reach of rational analysis. And if you question them, you are by definition a sexist or worse. So they got a certain amount of power just through this information, this scholarship about how, in this case, about how oppressed women were.
Yeah.
So you have to sympathize, and then they then kind of went off the deep end with this psychobabble and these psychodramas about, I'm triggered, and I mean, at Brown University, this was a year or so ago, and there was a story about it. You may have seen it, I'm sure you did, in the New York Times by Judith Shulevitz. At Brown University, they had a debate. So it was a feminist, two feminists actually, a libertarian feminist and someone else, another feminist, debating rape statistics. And you would think that's perfect. What more could the students want? They can hear both sides, and their side's well represented. No, they didn't want the debate at all, and they formed a safe room. And in that safe room, they were playing tapes of frolicking puppy dogs. They had bubbles, coloring books, Play-Doh.
Yeah.
Maybe I made up the Play-Doh. No, I think they had Play-Doh.
It was probably there.
It was there.
Yeah.
So this is so infantilizing. And again, I and many other feminists of my generation look at it and think, this is infantilization. This is the opposite of what feminism should be. And when I got to college, we threw out the dorm counselors and the guardians of our virtue and all that. We wanted to be in charge.
Yeah, so what went wrong, do you think? If there was there a moment that that something snapped? If in fact something went wrong and the feminist movement went from these two extremes, what do you think happened there?
Well, I think I know what happened. No one listens to me. I wrote this article in the Daily Beast where I pinpointed what happened. These, we should call these fainting couch feminists and purveyors of myth. They've been around for a long time. They've been in gender studies. It's too bad. But in 2011, a little-known apparatchik, a government official sent out...
That was going to sound conspiratorial.
Yeah.
If you went
No,
there.
but in this case, it's true. She sent out a letter to all the colleges and universities. She was the Assistant Secretary of Civil Rights, Ruslan Ali, and she sent out to all the colleges. And I think her intention was that they take more seriously that women are harassed on campus and there was too much sexual assault. But she went overboard. She's terrified the universities and made it seem like if they didn't immediately put like most men on trial and get them out of those schools and believe women, because she claimed there was this epidemic of sexual predation, and that the men at campuses like Yale and Swarthmore and so were just preying on women. So she sent this letter, and the schools now can be sued under Title IX, this equity statute. It's a wonderful statute. It was meant to be there to give women equal opportunities in education, but it's been twisted now, and they've kind of declared martial law on men on the campus because of this letter. It was 2011, and you look at that date, and then you see it brought words like trigger warning and safe space, this whole mindset of rather somewhat paranoid young women and their mentors on campus. It gave them the power to make a federal case, literally, of their perceptions.
Yeah, that's so interesting because I can see the line now to when you were talking about the catcalling, why the slippery slope exists. If you were to create a law, well, then you could be in this similar situation.
Well, now, once you have a law, they already had Title IX officers, but since 2011, that's probably the area of greatest growth on many campuses. They have dozens and dozens of people monitoring how the boys are treating the girls at Wesleyan. And these are mostly very privileged kids.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of drinking and I'm sure drunken hookups. But they have redefined drunken hookups to be rape of the young man against the young woman. So, of course, they call then there's a rape epidemic if you're going to enlarge the meaning of this horrible word, but you're going to enlarge it to include drunken hookups.
Bing, bing, bong, bong, bing, 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 bong, bing, bing, bong. When Mexico sends its people, bing, bong, bing, bong, they're not sending their best. Bing, bing, bong. And I said, we